Chapter 7, The Immediate Ripple, Impact on Their Contemporaries and the Follower Base. In the chronology of philosophy, some names burn brightest not in the stillness of centuries but in the crowded, weathered air of their own moment. Plato was one of those names. The ripples of his thought did not wait for the next generation to rise and discuss them. They began in the streets, in the seminars of the agora, in the uneasy conversations of political salons, and in the dormitories of the young men who would become his first circle of disciples. The immediate aftermath of his emergence as a teacher of the form and the good did not arrive as a single decree or a doctrinal manifesto. It arrived as a new cadence in talk, a new standard for questions, and a new appetite for a method that would shape how Athenians and their neighbors argued about virtue, knowledge, and the possibility of a better city. This chapter attempts to map that first, unsettled wave, the sudden pressure Plato put on his contemporaries and on those who would soon become his most loyal followers. The atmosphere into which Plato stepped was dense with cross-currents. The memory of Socrates hovered like a living argument in the air, the method of questioning, the insistence that a claim ought to be argued from first principles, the suspicion of rhetorical flourish that pretended to knowledge while concealing ignorance. Yet Socrates had not left behind a program, merely a challenge, to think, to examine, to demand justification for every commonly accepted belief. In 399 BCE Athens had executed Socrates for impiety and corrupting the youth. In the years that followed, through political turmoil, shifting alliances, and the slow erosion of trust in public life, Plato found a city still reverberating with questions Socrates himself had raised. To this already combustible mixture he brought a deliberate, expansive project, an interpretive method, a sustained inquiry into the nature of reality and virtue, and the conviction that philosophy should not merely explain the world but guide the shaping of it. Contemporaries who found themselves confronted by Plato's emergence first reacted, as mortals do to a new rival, with both curiosity and defense. The immediate ripple can be seen most clearly in three interwoven reactions: the contest with the sophists and their heirs, the challenge to existing schools of thought, especially those who prided themselves on rhetorical prowess or on a different style of inquiry, and the political moral suggestion that a philosopher's calm, systematic habit of mind might, if heeded, alter the governing of a city. The sophists, those itinerant teachers and polemicists who had once claimed the city's ear by teaching governing speech, rhetoric, and cleverness as a path to power, were not simply opponents but a diagnostic tool for Plato's own sense of education. The sophists had cultivated skill as a means to success. They profited from the city's demand for quick wins and practical utility. Plato, by contrast, insisted that the highest instruction was not a toolbox for winning debates or persuading crowds, but a discipline that would lead one toward knowledge of forms and the good, toward a life that makes sense under rational scrutiny. The tension between the realist, normative thrust of the Platonic program and the sophistic emphasis on technique and eloquence would shape the Academy's earliest debates. In public discourse, you could hear the echo of Socratic method refracted through dialogue and argument. The immediate effect on contemporaries was a sharpened sense that the city needed not merely clever talk but a shared standard by which to judge whether talk is sound. Within the circle of Athens' philosophical and intellectual players, the arrival of Plato's Academy reorganized the field in two crucial ways. First, it introduced a stable, organized space for sustained exchange of ideas. The Academy did not simply produce pamphlets and ephemeral debates. It assembled a community, a village of inquiry, where students would be shaped through repeated exposure to dialectic, mathematics, and the kind of rigorous questioning that demanded clear reasons. The present tense of this arrangement was not just a school but a social event, gatherings that bound together teachers and pupils, masters and mentees, who would think themselves into a shared enterprise. Second, Plato's approach reframed the ends of education. If the older tradition valued rhetorical success and moral exhortation as the signs of a life well lived, Plato offered a longer arc, the cultivation of the mind toward a rational understanding of reality, ethics, and meaning. That arc, once introduced into the city's air, could not be undone or easily silenced. The contemporaries who would become the Academy's first true generation, Speusippus, Xenocrates, and later Polemo and others, were not merely assistants or imitators. They were co-architects of a project that would outlive the immediate moment of Plato's life. Speusippus, Plato's nephew, inherited the mantle when Plato died and helped to translate the dialogue form into a living curriculum. Xenocrates, a stern, careful thinker, contributed a robust account of virtue and teleology that tried to connect the ethical life to a larger order of being. These men did not produce cut-and-dried systems overnight. They were, in a sense, early editors of a manuscript that would be rewritten in every generation. The follower base began to crystallize around a common program: trained dialectic, disciplined inquiry into first principles, a careful separation of opinion from knowledge, and a shared commitment to examining the most difficult questions in ethics, metaphysics, and politics. The philosopher Aristotle, stood among them not as a rival in the moment but as a student. He joined Plato's circle in his youth and studied there for nearly 2 decades, absorbing the tools, the temper, and the ambition of the academy. The presence of a mind as keen as Aristotle's in the academy's first decades was both a compliment and a pressure. It affirmed the seriousness of the project while also suggesting that the method could be stretched toward fresh horizons. Aristotle's later departure, when the time came to escape the shadows of the master and to begin his own path at the Lyceum after Plato's death, would only intensify the sense that the academy's work was a living conversation rather than a closed school. In the immediate ripple of Plato's life, Aristotle's presence read as a sign of vitality. The training ground was doing its job, provoking questions that demanded new forms of argument and new kinds of evidence. The political climate of Athens, still haunted by the oscillations of democracy, oligarchy, and factional politics, also contributed to the ripple. Plato did not arrive in a city that was neutral toward philosophy. He found a citizenry already wary of those who claimed to offer universal truths, especially truths so systematized that they might seem to circumvent the city's plural voices. If the sophists had thrived by offering practical, polished speeches aimed at persuasion in the courts and on the assembly floor, Plato offered a claim to universality that could appear, to some, as an attempt to override local custom with a more general, supposedly true order. The immediate response, therefore, was not simply intellectual but political. Some saw in the academy a useful ally to a hopeful, rational state. Others feared the prospect of a city guided by the abstract reasoning of a class of philosophical elites. The tension did not vanish in a single confrontation. Rather, it produced a cautious but growing suspicion about whether the philosopher could be trusted with the reins of governance. Moreover, Plato's method of presenting his philosophy, through dialogues in which Socrates serves as the central figure, had a practical effect on how his contemporaries understood argument. The dialogue format forced readers and listeners to engage with the process of inquiry rather than merely the end product of doctrine. This method, in turn, seeded a habit among his followers, to test beliefs in conversation, to escalate questions rather than retreat from them, and to insist that a theory of politics, education, or ethics must be defended by coherent reasoning and a demonstration of consistency across related questions. The result for the immediate circle of thinkers and students was a discipline of mind that could resist easy slogans, a standard that their teachers themselves could not easily satisfy. The ripple extended beyond Athens only as far as those who could access and engage with the living body of the academy or who could convey its method into other cities, schools, and households. The follower base of Plato, even in the earliest phase, began to take on a shape that would endure beyond his lifetime. It was not a monolithic sect, but a constellation of learners who were drawn to a common premise and who interpreted it in diverse ways, depending on their local concerns and intellectual temperaments. The first generation of adherents in Athens did not simply replicate Plato's words, they absorbed the habit of inquiry and the expectation of a rigorous, reflective life. They would carry the mother project forward by translating it into local programs of instruction, by shaping the way philosophy was taught, and by pushing the boundaries of what counted as knowledge and what counted as wisdom. In this sense, the immediate ripple can be seen in the formation of a living community that had both unity and variety. The unity emerged from their shared commitment to dialectic, to a rigorous inquiry into the nature of reality and virtue, and to the belief that philosophy had practical relevance to human life and political order. The variety emerged from the different personalities of the earliest Academy members, from their distinctive interests, some focusing more on ethics and political philosophy, others drawn to metaphysical questions of the forms and the good, still others keen to connect philosophy with mathematics and science. Some would emphasize the rational ascent from opinion to knowledge, others would stress the moral end of human life and the social responsibilities of the educated class. This blend of unity and variety would become the hallmark of Plato's follower base for centuries to come. A particular site of that early ripple, perhaps the most vivid to a student of intellectual history, was the way in which the Academy entered into dialogue with other schools and traditions, including the Megarian school, led by Euclid of Megara, and various Pythagorean-influenced circles that still persisted in the city and its neighboring towns. The Megarians, with their sharp attention to logic and a distinctly practical, sometimes skeptical approach to epistemology, offered a counterpoint to the idealist tendencies of Plato's arguments. The early dialogues show Plato negotiating a path between these currents. He does not abandon the demand for universal reasons or for an objective order to the cosmos. He also refuses to reduce philosophy to mere syllogistic cleverness or to a rhetoric of persuasion divorced from truth. The immediate ripple, then, is a scholarly cross-pollination. The Academy's members heard the critiques, absorbed the strengths of rival positions, and sharpened their own tools accordingly. The result was not a dogmatic monolith but a living tradition capable of absorbing critique and continuing the conversation. The ripple also reached the city's youth, the young gentlemen whose fathers or patrons sent them to the Academy in hopes that they would acquire discipline of mind and ethical seriousness. The sight of young Athenians immersed in debate, their minds tuned to questions about justice, virtue, and the good life, made an impression on public audiences. Some onlookers were skeptical, yet there was a growing sense that something important was happening, a formalization of thinking that could train a citizen to deliberate about the commonweal rather than merely to speak well about it. For those who joined the follower base, this meant a training that went beyond memorization of a creed or a set of rules. It promised a habit of mind that could be tested by argument, that could be proven through reasoned discourse, and that could be extended to the governance of life itself. If one looks for a concrete image of the immediate ripple, one might imagine a round of conversations that ran late into the night in the precincts of the Academy or in the shade of the city walls, with young men testing propositions, older mentors guiding them through the scaffolding of an argument, and a culture gradually forming that valued questions over ready answers. One might picture a group of students, Speusippus as the elder, Xenocrates as the disciplined, a few younger men who would later themselves teach and write, sitting over problem sets, sketching outlines of a philosophy that would later be refined into the Academy's enduring tradition. And in the background, the city's rough and tumble politics, councils debating survival, magistrates weighing the temptations of power, and a citizenry trying to discern what kind of leadership would help them endure the aftershocks of long-standing conflict. In this living theatre, the dialogue as a practice and a group of learners as a social project, the immediate ripple found its form. It is essential to acknowledge the limitations of our view. The sources that describe Plato's life and the earliest years of his Academy are fragmentary and often filtered through later writers who themselves possessed their own interpretive aims. We know that the Academy endured for centuries, that Speusippus and Xenocrates were real figures who directed the early institution, and that Aristotle, perhaps the most consequential student of Plato, supplied a living proof of the Academy's educational reach. We know that the philosophical questions Plato raised, what is justice, what is knowledge, what is the nature of the good, found a ready audience among those who would become the city's intellectual leaders. Yet the precise mechanics of how the immediate ripple worked in every city, or how many minds were converted or unsettled in a single year, are not all accessible to us. What we can claim with confidence is that, in the years following Socrates' death and in the decades immediately afterward, Plato's approach, his insistence on a disciplined method, his search for a universal order, his confidence that philosophy could guide political life, began to shape the way educated people thought about knowledge, virtue, and public duty. The follower base emerged precisely because that approach offered a new, coherent way of thinking that could be taught, debated, and transmitted. In closing, the immediate ripple of Plato's entry into the philosophical scene did not present itself as a tally of adherents or a list of doctrinal innovations alone. It presented itself as a reorganization of intellectual life, a school as a social institution, a method as a mode of life, and a program as a horizon toward which minds could move. The contemporaries, rivals, critics, collaborators, and curious observers found themselves confronted with a new framework for understanding what it means to know, to judge, and to live well. The follower base, the earliest academy, was not merely a cohort of students who happened to sit at the feet of a great teacher. It was a community that learned how to think in a disciplined, public, and durable way. The immediate ripple, in that sense, was nature's invitation to a project that would outlive Plato's own years by many generations, shaping the form of Western philosophy as a continuous conversation about what counts as true, what matters in life, and how a city should be governed by the measured, reasonable citizen who dares to seek the good. The chapter of that ripple had begun, and the story of Plato was no longer the story of one mind but the birth of a tradition that would bear his name and carry his questions into the centuries.